Good morning and welcome to this TIER webinar. My name is Burnett Blake, a project coordinator for TIER, which is Tiered Intervention Using Evidence-Based Research. Today we have Dr. Thea Woodruff here to present on reading intervention within remote learning environments. And so we are going to attend to how to assist our students in the area of reading to ensure that they have what they need within our remote learning settings. Within your screen today, please attend to the right side or look to the right side for your icons. You can ask questions, raise your hand, send me a message, and I will respond. And as Dr. Woodruff is going through her presentation, you feel free to ask any questions and we will attend to those as we go through. At the end of our session today, we will have a survey. Last session went really well. However, our response rate was a bit low. So once we do reach the end, we would really appreciate any feedback once our presentation is over. That being said, Dr. Woodruff, if you are ready, we are so excited to hear about just guidance and any suggestions that we can receive within the area of reading for remote learning.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Burnett. My name's Thea Woodruff, like Burnett said, and I have worked on the TIER project for the last year, and I've worked before that on response to intervention projects, various projects with the state and research. And what I'm going to be talking about today is remote learning environments with reading intervention. And I'm going to try to give you some ideas about what reading can look like, specifically for students who are struggling, some ideas and things to maybe try in your classes and with your students as you work with them in these interventions. So this is the third webinar in this series. The information in here comes from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, the National Center on Intensive Intervention, so that's the NCII group, and then COVID-19 guidance provided by TEA. So we have all of those that we've kind of put together to try to create this presentation. And honestly, too, a lot of the stuff that's in here is stuff that I've tried in working to do presentations with teachers and just to kind of model some things. And then also what I've done, what I've seen working with my own kiddos. I have an 8-year-old and a 13-year-old. And so some of the things I've seen the teachers doing and some of the things that I've thought about trying to figure out how to do these reading interventions. And we're all kind of figuring this out. So do know that you have to give yourself a little bit of practice and self-compassion around this stuff and trying to figure it out as we go. So but hopefully you'll get some ideas. So we're going to start, of course, just by reviewing the MTSS framework and what we mean by that and the basics. I'm going to go through that kind of quickly because we always start with that in these webinars just to make sure we're all on the same page. But that's probably background information you have. Then the big part of this is going to be, of course, the remote reading interventions for students who have targeted and intensive instructional needs. And then hopefully you'll get several resources maybe that you can access here at the end of this presentation. There'll be a couple throughout, but some ideas for things you can go to and learn more about some of the things I'm going to talk about today related to reading interventions. Okay, so let's first, like I said, start with this MTSS, this kind of the framework, and just a little bit of review here probably for some folks. Make sure we're all on the same page. So this is the MTSS framework. Of course, we know that we have these 3 tiers: universal, targeted, and intensive levels of intervention. I'll talk about those in a second. The idea here is to create an integrated system to support the academic and behavioral needs. And so I think next week's webinar will be talking about behavior with David Barrett. Assessment and data are extremely important, of course, and you're going to see that as I talk about what's necessary in reading intervention. So we have to collect data, and that's trickier, obviously, in remote settings. But we do have some guidance from assessment providers for conducting assessments online. And so I'm going to give you some of those resources to go in and access and look at what they talk about in conducting assessments remotely. And then, of course, using the data, we can use the data and do that. That's kind of on our own. But talking about how, I'm going to talk a little bit about that because that data is really, really important when we're talking about providing these interventions and differentiating instruction. And then, of course, identifying students in need and providing that additional support as early as we can, right, in this framework. So this framework applies both in person, of course, which is what we prefer, or at least I prefer. Some people may like teaching remote learning environments, but also in remote learning environments and trying to move students, making this progress toward their goals. All right, so very quickly, of course, we know universal interventions. This is our tier 1 or core content area instruction. Of course, this requires evidence-based practices, research-based curricula, so using materials that have a research base, differentiation, scaffolding, explicit instruction, which we're going to get into and talk about in relation to reading interventions. And what we would, based on the research we know and from the science, if we can do this really well, we're talking about 80% of students getting their needs met just through universal instruction. Now, some of us may not be at that 80%, and that means we really need to look at our universal interventions and see how we can improve on them to make sure we are doing what research says. All right, of course, then we have tier 2 or targeted intervention. This is designed for students who have not super intensive needs, but some level of needs that need to be supplemented to the universal intervention. So this can actually happen both inside and outside the general education classroom. It just kind of depends on your model and how you've set it up. So sometimes general education teachers provide this targeted instruction. Sometimes you have an interventionist who can provide it, and sometimes it's a combination of those. So this is small group. These are students who have specific kind of targeted needs, and you're going to group them same ability, right? So kind of homogeneous grouping, trying to meet those needs and then trying to exit them from intervention. So the idea is to get these students out. And of course, we talk about 20% of students needing this targeted instruction. So you got 80% of the universal and then 20% needing this targeted intervention. Now, of course, you do have some students who don't respond to that targeted intervention and they have more intensive needs, right? And so this is where we're going to get into this tier 3 or this intensive intervention. They're not making enough progress in tier 2. There's persistently low achievement, right? So you can imagine, you guys know some of these kiddos when they come into, say, the beginning of 2nd grade, they're barely able to read any words in the text, maybe not at all. And so those would be these kind of kids who we're talking about who have these high intensity needs. In special education, tier 3 can happen outside of special education. It can happen in dyslexia classes or it can not happen in those. So it just, again, it depends on your model and how you've set it up and conceptualize and are implementing this. And of course, this is going to be a very, very small number of students. So we're talking about 5% or less of students who need these intensive interventions. In fact, in some of the research that Jack Fletcher and others folks have gotten, they've gotten these percents down very, very small, but it requires us to do these really strong tier 1 and tier 2 in kinder, 1st, 2nd grade. And so if we're doing those things really well, then we'll have very small numbers, hopefully, that are needing this intensive intervention. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to do that quickly. I should say too, as I go through this, I have a lot of information in this section on remote reading intervention. If you need me to slow down or if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. And Burnett is going to signal me and try to get me to maybe stop talking so that I can answer some of those questions or just give you a little bit more time to kind of process what I'm talking about here. So let's get into this remote reading intervention information. So of course we have to know our text, right? Our reading language arts text. And this graphic is the one that has been created by TEA. I like this little tree here. And this is basically, these different branches, these different strands of the text. So we have the foundational skills, the comprehension, response skills, multiple genres, author's purpose and craft, composition, so writing, and then inquiry and research. So when it comes to intervention, here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about this. When it comes to intervention, where do we typically have to focus based on students' needs? Where do students typically have to? Is it up in those leaves, those higher level skills, or is it down in the foundational, the roots and the trunk? If you want to respond to that, just type something type in the chat what you think, where you think we need to focus on this graphic here. And I'll stop for a second.
All right, so we have quite a few people that have responded, Thea. So foundational skills, roots, foundational skills, roots. Seems
That's
to be the
exactly right.
consensus. Yeah.
Yay, you know your stuff. That is exactly correct. So yes, when we're talking about kiddos who are struggling, we're talking about most students having gaps in these foundational skills like you guys talked about. So things like phonemic awareness, right? Phonological awareness, phonics, word reading, spelling, morphology. So understanding morphology is basically those prefixes, suffixes, roots, base words. That's where they're struggling. And then also comprehension skills, basic comprehension skills, and being able to like figure out main ideas, being able to summarize, asking their own questions, those kinds of things. So that's really where we're going to focus when we're talking about interventions in tier 2 and tier 3 is we're talking about focusing on these foundational skills, even with older kiddos. So even with kiddos who are in secondary schools and middle and high school. And I really I always try to pay attention to Jack Fletcher because he's always providing this up-to-date information from research. And he was talking last year at a meeting we were having, and he was citing some research that they had just come out with looking at kiddos who were struggling on STAR in middle school. So 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, they pulled these kids who were really struggling on STAR and they gave them some other assessments to try to figure out what was going on. 80% of those kids, it was a word reading issue. 80%. So think about that. That's so many of those students. 4 out of 5 of the students are having word reading issues that are causing those comprehension problems on STAR. So realize that we're talking about this even for those older kids having to fill those gaps in interventions. So as I go through this and I talk about these 10 kind of policies and practices, I'm going to focus on those foundational skills and then comprehension skills. So you're going to see that when I start to give you ideas about activities and things to do both synchronously and asynchronously for kiddos who are needing these kind of these gap filling interventions, these targeted and intensive interventions. So this is one of the handouts that you were given is this 10 key policies and practices for reading intervention. The Meadows Center puts these 10 keys lists out all the time, and this is one of them. This is a great one. So I hope you access this. I hope you have time once I get done with this webinar to actually look through it. There's a lot of really good information in it. I'm of course going to go through it very quickly today because I don't have a super long amount of time to do this. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these 10 key policies and practices and just kind of highlight how they might, I'm going to talk about them real quickly and then I'm going to talk about how they might look in a remote setting. So these first 5 are protecting scheduled small group time. So making sure you have this small group time scheduled. Universal screening, of course, diagnostic, using informal diagnostic assessment if you need to get more information on students, grouping and regrouping students for interventions. So as you're working with students, students may need to move out of interventions if they're starting to accelerate, and they're starting to master some of these skills. They may need to be moved into a higher level intervention group that looks more like them or their needs look more similar. And then, of course, we have to do progress monitoring when we're doing interventions. That's the way we document and track student progress. If you're not doing progress monitoring, you're not doing RTI, and you're not going to be doing, or MTSS well, and you're not going to be doing interventions very well because you're not going to be checking to see, is this intervention working? And if it's not, you've got to do something different. In a little bit, I'll show you some data that kind of gets at that and can help us to think about whether interventions are working. And then, again, thinking, what does that mean for instruction? And then these are, of course, these last slide, these get into more of the instruction. So explicit instruction, practice opportunities. These kids need lots and lots of practice, time on task with these skills. And that's what you're going to have to provide both synchronously and asynchronously, and try to give them supports as they're working asynchronously to practice these skills. Systematic instruction with scaffolding, feedback. Feedback's tricky in remote learning. I'm not going to lie. It's a tricky, you're going to have to kind of get creative, but we have to provide that feedback. We know feedback is so important, especially for kiddos who struggle in these different areas. Giving, and then of course you studying up, teachers studying, learning this knowledge and having, knowledge of what high quality intervention looks like. And then also having good materials, good high quality programs to use. So especially in tier 2, but also in tier 3, having these programs and materials that we can rely on that we can use to help us implement these interventions is really important. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these 10 policies and practices. and give you an idea of what they are and then what they can look like remotely. And again, some of these slides have a lot of information on them, so I'm going to try to slow down at certain points and even pause to kind of let you look over that information. Okay, so this first one is this protecting small group time. So we really have to prioritize these interventions and prioritize these kiddos who we cannot let these gaps get bigger. So how can we do that? We have to have a sense of urgency. We cannot cancel interventions. We have to have these interventions, and that means having them at least 3 times a week, if not every day, especially for the intensive, those tier 3, the kids, those students need every day, daily intervention. So at least 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, especially for older kids who have some of these gaps, maybe up to 45 minutes. And then also providing them extra practice activities that they can do once they get done in these interventions. So this is one of the slides I was talking about that has a lot of information on it. So let me just talk about this for a second. When I say synchronous, probably everybody knows these words now. We never probably would have realized that we would know these words synchronous and asynchronous except for this time. Synchronous is real-time instruction. So when you're providing that instruction over Zoom or over whatever platform you're using, Google Meets, whatever it is that you're using, and you're meeting with students and you're providing that intervention. So this is the ongoing instruction. This is the real-time instruction. Asynchronous is when you give the students something to do on their own time. So it's more, they can do it whenever they have time. It's a little bit more flexible, okay? So we need to have both of these. We're gonna have to have both of these to be able to teach in this remote environment. And so what I just try to do here is take some of these foundational skills, so phonological awareness, phonics, word study, handwriting. We really should be connecting handwriting with learning the letters and learning the sound. So as kids are forming those letters, they should be saying the letter name or saying the letter sound. And that then connects that eye, ear, and hand in the brain, right? So we're trying to neurologically connect these parts of the brain. So the more we can have students practicing, so that's why I have handwriting here, is we should really be connecting that with the sounds and with learning the letters and the graphemes, right? The representation in print, and then fluency. So what I just have here are just some examples of what we can do synchronously with kiddos. So when we're working with them and they're with us real time, and then what are some things we can give them to do asynchronously. So let me talk about some of these synchronous examples. We'll just start in the PA phonics area. We can do things like, of course, we can play phonological awareness games. And the nice thing about phonological awareness is you don't necessarily have to have a lot of materials for that. You can have a game from the Florida Center or something like that. But you can just be giving kids, giving them words and then you guys practicing, segmenting them into those sounds, deleting sounds off of words, counting syllables and words. You can give students, you can share your screen, right? And use like a slide from PowerPoint, or you can use the whiteboard if you have a whiteboard within whatever platform you're using, like Zoom has a whiteboard. So you can use that whiteboard to actually like put words up and have the students sounding out and blending those words. I'm gonna show you an example of that in a little bit that I put together. You can give kids words to spell. So if they have, I know my daughter's teacher actually sent whiteboards home. So we went and picked up a whiteboard at someone's house at one of the parents' houses. They just put them out on the porch, and we got a expo and a whiteboard. So you can have kids writing on whiteboards and then turning around and showing you the words that they've spelled, so you can check that. So that's a possibility. When we're talking about asynchronous, a lot of this is going to be, you're going to see, I'm going to have a lot of like recording yourself. So if you can record yourself doing things that kids can do, activities with you, it's almost like you're becoming like somebody on a TV, right? Like Sesame Street or something, where the kids are interacting with you together, right? You can post lists of words for the students to practice sounding out and reading, recording yourself saying words for the students to spell, so that you can say a word, then they can spell, and then you can give them some kind of way of checking and correcting their spelling. And again, recording yourself, maybe modeling a game that they could play with word building or with a word sort, and then giving them the materials, posting some materials for them to use to then do a similar word sort or word building. Handwriting, of course, modeling. So again, using that, maybe using the whiteboard to kind of show how and you could do this on your, on your own whiteboard, just making a video of yourself and practicing, recording yourself, modeling how to form those letters, and giving students practice. So they need to practice that handwriting skills. So if you can get them some kind of materials, there are free handwriting sheets. I actually used those with my daughter last spring to teach her cursive because she wanted to learn free handwriting sheets, or you can send those home. And then fluency, of course, echo and choral reading. So we can do that just like we would do other places. You can, either the kids can pull up whatever it is you want to read on their computer and read it off the screen, or if you can send it home, they can print it out, or you can send packets home. Like I know my kids, every once in a while, their teachers put out packets that we go and we can pick up, or that kind of thing. So, and again, of course, recording yourself and having students record themselves. That's actually a really good way to do. I'm going to show you that in a little bit too, an example of that. Let me pause right there just for a second and let you look at that and see if anybody has any questions or ideas from that. Okay, if everybody's okay, let me show you the next screen because it also has some of these. So very similar thing with vocabulary, syntax, and comprehension. So thinking about how we can teach, and a lot of these synchronous things are very similar to what we do in person. It's just doing it over Zoom or whatever in these platforms, or Google Meets, whatever you're using. So vocabulary, we can teach words directly, do a word sort related to morphology, so those prefixes, suffixes, roots. Recording yourself doing some of these things and having students record themselves. Syntax, so playing games like with word building. So a sentence anagram is where we take a sentence, we cut it up, and then we have the students build the sentence using those words. So we can play a game like that. We can put words on a slide and move them around and give them to kids kind of randomly. We can give them a slide with words randomly put on it, and then they have to move those things around. So that's a possibility. Doing some think aloud, so recording ourselves thinking aloud about how to do these things, how to put these sentences together, or like the next one, the comprehension, reading a text and thinking aloud. Filling out a graphic organizer together with the students while we're reading a text or after we read a text. And then, of course, we know these things, getting students to ask questions and answer questions. It's just kind of being creative if you're doing it asynchronously, giving them some things to do on their own, where you're recording yourself doing some things and then having the kids maybe record themselves too. And an easy, free way to have students record themselves that my daughter's been using for the last 6 months is Flipgrid. She's been using that. It's a free application you can get on. I actually have created my own Flipgrid, and in a little bit you'll see how we recorded ourselves doing that. Let me stop there just for a second because there's a lot of information on this slide too. Does anybody have any questions about any of that?
No, I think they're all feverishly taking notes. So okay. Our attentiveness is pretty high right now.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so let's keep going, and we're going to talk a little bit now about trying to do some of these assessments. So we know screening is assessing all students. We're really trying to identify students who are in need of more intensive interventions, more targeted interventions. We need to make sure that we're using screening measures that are valid, reliable, and efficient, right? So this shouldn't take a long time. Screening should be a very quick, less than 10 minutes with each student. That's really the idea, is you're trying to get quick information so you can screen out all those kids who look fine and then really target, okay, here's our 20% of kids who we really need to focus in on and provide these interventions to. And this data tool selection guidance, this is actually in that other handout that I gave you. There's a tier handout that has all of the links to all of the things I'm going to be talking about. So this data selection guidance for pre-K through 2, we know that Texas has given some, TEA has given some specific guidance about the screening measures that we should be using in these grades. So that link, and it's in your, like I said, it's in the handout too. It's the very first one under Texas Education Agency. It says Data Tool Selection Guidance. If you open that up and click on that, that will take you to the guidance that says the screening measures. And so they've already kind of identified. In other grades, you're going to have I'll give you some other tools that can help you figure out screening and progress monitoring data in a little bit. Okay, so what it looks like remotely. I mean, this is tricky. It's not, it's trickier definitely than in person, but basically what you need to do is once you and the kids kind of get used to this whole idea of working through video and doing these instructional things through video. Once you get comfortable with that, don't try to do your assessments right off the bat because that's not going to work very well. But once you get comfortable with that, scheduling one-on-one time with each student, like I said, about 10, up to 10 minutes. Some things may not even take that long. Some of these screening measures, are 1 minute, timed assessments. One-on-one time with students to conduct this screening. So if you think about, break it up, it doesn't have to be all done in one day. So do a few students a day. If you want to try to get it done in, say, 2 or 3 weeks, you could do 3 or 4 students a day. You could do 5 to 8 students. Plan those out and plan that one-on-one time with the students, and then give the rest of the class asynchronous activities. So while you're doing this one-on-one screening, the other students can be doing asynchronous activities that are going to keep them working on the skills that they need to do that. So let's look at an example of this here. So these are just examples. I just pulled some of the possible screening measures that you could be using based on, measures that are out there that I know that are reading screening measures. So for example, kindergarten, letter naming fluency, that's a common one we use, phoneme segmentation fluency. Each of these only takes a minute to get. So if you basically schedule this, you could do about, it would take you about maybe 5 or 6 minutes per student to do this. And while you're doing this, then your students can be listening to you doing a read aloud. They can draw a picture in response to the read aloud. Maybe you can give them a little phonological awareness game to play, like a rhyming game or some kind of easy game to play. First grade, word reading, word recognition fluency. Again, these are each 1 minute timed activities. Oral reading fluency in 4th grade. We can do oral reading fluency all the way up through, even into high school, we can do that. 7th grade, I gave this maze, so that's where they're filling in the blanks. So these are all screening things you can do. You can do them, but you just would have to meet with the students, like I said, one-on-one, schedule that synchronous time with them, and then give the other students some asynchronous things to do. So if you think about this and you break it up across time, hopefully it wouldn't seem quite so daunting. And in the handouts in a little bit, when I get to the resources at the end, there's a couple that have some really good videos of teachers doing screening and progress monitoring remotely with students, specifically oral reading fluency. So you can see how they do that. So I would recommend watching those videos because they're pretty good, and I'll highlight those when I get to those links. Informal diagnostics. So this is not, you're not going to do diagnostics with every single student. These are the students who, after you've done the screening, you get down to those 20%, and it's not even doing diagnostics necessarily with all 20% of the students in intervention. These are just the kids who you really need, they got a 0 on oral reading fluency. They can't read any words, maybe at the beginning of 2nd grade or maybe beginning of 3rd grade to get a 10 on oral reading fluency, but like, what does that mean? So you need more information, right, than just that 0 or that 10. You need to know, like, where are they decoding wise? Where are they maybe with phonemic awareness, like some of these more fundamental skills? So you're going to need to do something. You're going to need to get again with them one-on-one and kind of do a little bit more diagnosing to try to just figure out where am I even going to start in this intervention. So that's the idea here behind these informal diagnostics, is knowing where to start. You can actually use data from the screen. So if you get some good information, like oral reading fluency, when you do that, you can do an error analysis, right? And that's going to give you information about how they did. You'll see in this chart here where I have decoding, word study or advanced decoding, and then sight word reading. The second bullet on each of those is error analysis of passage reading, right? Error analysis of passage reading. That's what I mean by that, is when you're reading, when they're doing an oral reading fluency check, you get data from that about the words that they're struggling with, what are the errors that they made, and we'll look at an example of that in a second. So that's what I mean by diagnostic. And spelling is a really good diagnostic. If you can figure out a way to get spelling data from students, so giving a spelling inventory, if you can figure out a way to do that through Zoom, through whatever platform you're using to do these videos, but that data can get you, or get a writing sample from the kiddos. So have them write and then look at their writing sample and see what are the errors that they're making in the writing sample. The spelling inventory is just a little bit more structured. So it's going to cut across all these different spelling patterns and give you a good idea of where to start. Spelling data is my favorite data to use for kind of thinking about targeting instruction. So let's look at an example of this. So for example, you have a student read, right? And you listen to them and you do this, you do it through video and they're reading and you're doing a fluency check. And as you're doing the fluency, these are the errors. that the student is making. So the student reads storm as sturm. They can't read the word hurricanes. Oceans, they drop this at the end. Scientists, they read as skint. Patterns, again, they drop that S at the end and they misread the The stronger, they drop the at the end. So you can see these mistakes, right, that they're making. And if we kind of create a chart like this where we can see it, then we can start to see the patterns, right? We can see the patterns and the things that that they're missing here. So let me pause for a second. Look at this chart. And if you were going to focus on, think about diagnostically with the student, where are you going to start? What is this student struggling with? What would be some things we could target in our intervention with the student? And go ahead and just put it in the chat.
Okay, we have vowel patterns from
Yep.
Cynthia and from Haley, from Vanessa as well. Yeah, vowel patterns is the consensus.
Vowel patterns for sure, right? And that's a big one for a who that's their issue, is they really get stuck on these because we don't teach them well. The vowel patterns are very difficult. All those long vowel patterns, even short vowels for a lot of kiddos are difficult. We can also see the ending sounds, right? Dropping the ending sounds, and multisyllabic word reading. And again, that's a biggie. We sort of assume that kids are just going to figure out these multisyllabic words. We've got to teach them ways to break these multisyllabic words up into syllables and morphemes to be able to read them. And then morphemes are actually nice because then that connects into meaning and figuring out the meaning of those words. All right. So then also this next policy, this next practice is grouping and regrouping, right? So based on needs. So being flexible in our grouping practices and thinking about, okay, I've grouped these students together, they were working, and now let me check and see, does it make sense for these students to stay together in this intervention group, or should some students move out because they are starting to get it and they're past where these kids are, or maybe there's a student who's really, really struggling and needs to drop into a different intervention group that needs more intensive intervention. I can tell you, every time I go in to model lessons in small group, I've done a lot of that over the last couple of years for teachers. There's always, and it's so funny because the teachers can see it when they're sitting there watching me, there's always at least one or two kids who are either who are too high for that group, who need to move on from that group, or who maybe one or two students who are kind of struggling and need more support in a different group because I can't meet their needs because these kids are getting it and moving on, and I need these kids to be in a different group. So that happens all the time. So this is an example here on the slide. We've got these kids, they were actually grouped based on they were based on a fluency measure, right? So we had grouped them based on fluency, and then we gave them a decoding assessment later on, like kind of partway through the intervention. We give this decoding assessment, and we've got this kiddo, Christian, who doesn't look like the other students on that, right? Can you see there where he's got 70, 90, and 60? He looks better on diphthongs, R-controlled, and multisyllabic words than the other kiddos. So when we're working on phonics skills, he actually shouldn't be in this group. He needs to move to a higher level group, and maybe not even needing intervention. At some point, some kids just don't need to be in the tier 2 group anymore, maybe, or even tier 3. We can move kids out of tier 3. I know it's sometimes more difficult to do, but we can shift these kids out of these interventions. So that's what we're trying to constantly do, is really look at that data and think about, is this the right group for this kiddo? Is this going to meet their needs, or should we move them on? Now we can also do what I call grouping within a group. So let me show you an example. Oh, sorry, there we go. I don't think I had that color up there. And there you can see what I'm talking about with Christian. I should have clicked there. So there's Christian and moving him out. Now let me talk about grouping within a group, because that's a little bit different. So sometimes we have this group, and this is what it would look like remotely, right? We have this synchronous, this tier 2 group we're working with. And as you're working with them, you kind of notice really still needing more of your support, right? So you keep working with them, and then so these other two, they're kind of getting it. Like, they don't need to sit here and keep working with these 3 students. Maybe I can take those 2 kids and move them into doing something asynchronously that's going to either allow them to build more automaticity with this skill, or maybe to do some kind of extension activity with it, right? So we could break them up into 2 different groups. So 3 kiddos stay with you and continue getting synchronous instruction. And then for these other two kiddos, you may say, you know what, why don't you guys go, and you guys are going to go and do this other asynchronous activity. Now that means you have to plan for it a little bit, right? You have to have an idea of what these kids could do, but it could just be like if you're working on reading maybe a text, right? And you need these three kiddos to stay with you because they're still struggling with some of the words in the text. You need to work on some multisyllabic word reading or some decoding skills. While these other two kids, they've got it. They can read this text pretty fluently. Maybe they just go and practice reading that text a little bit more and then write a summary of what they learned from the text, right? And then next time you guys get back together in your group, they can share that with you, okay? So you can group within a group. I get asked by teachers all the time, is that okay to do? Yes, it's okay to do. You're meeting the kids' different needs. Okay, and of course, progress monitoring. So this is our more frequent, so every week or 2 weeks, depending on how often we really want to look at that data and check in on kids and see if they're on track and to meet the goals that we've set for them. These are quick. So again, these are 1-minute assessments. So I know they're more frequent and that's a little bit stressful, but they're short. So this is again, scheduling that synchronous time every week or 2 weeks with individual kiddos just to listen to them read, to do these check-ins. And it should take, 2 or 3 or 4 minutes with the kiddos to do these. And again, we're going to look at the data visually to try to see our kids making the progress we want. So let's look at what I mean by looking at it visually. So line graphs, we really want to graph these data to see, because it's hard to see numbers. It's hard to know if those numbers are adding up to, are they going to hit that goal that we've set for them? So we have some pretty simple examples here on this slide. We've got an intervention that's not being effective, right? So we have the aim line there, that red line, that's the goal line that we've set for the student. And this student, the one on this left side, on my left side here, is not making the progress that we want. This means we need to do something different in the intervention. The intervention is not being effective, so we need to try something different. Don't just keep doing the same thing if it's not working. Now the bottom one is a positive, right? The bottom one, we've set this aim line, the red line, and the student's actually achieving above that. They're getting where we need them to go. So this is a kiddo, intervention's working, we can keep doing it, and eventually we may say, you know what, we could exit this kid out of this intervention because they have gotten back up where they need to be. They don't need to be in intervention anymore. Now, of course, we would like for data to look like that. It doesn't always look that way in progress monitoring. So here's what a lot of times is a little bit more typical, especially with kiddos who have more intensive needs, who are really trying to figure out what's going on with this kiddo reading wise. What's happening in this progress monitoring graph is we started with an intervention 1. And you see that. And so we have this first intervention and we start doing it with the student, and we've got their goal line there, the gray line, and we put a trend line through their data, and the trend line, it's positive, but it's not positive enough. They're just not making the progress. So what happens is, where we have that blue line on November 3rd, the teacher something different. I'm going to do something a little different in this intervention to try to see if I can improve the progress, accelerate the progress the student's making. Well, we can see that second intervention didn't really work either. So then a third, they tried. And so what we're doing is we're trying to see, are these interventions working? If they're not, do something different. And anytime you do something different, that you change an intervention, it's good to mark it so you know this is where I changed. And then we can graph that progress from there to see, is it now accelerating the student's progress like we want? And of course, you can see the fourth intervention, that's where it really started to work. They figured out, okay, let's do this. And then that changed the trajectory. And you can see there now the student is able to meet that goal line. And this is how we want to track progress, is in this kind of more sophisticated way, is looking at that over time and then marking it, right? And saying, okay, so we changed the intervention. Let's look at over time within this intervention what we did. This is the way that in research, this is how we look at data. And so trying to move toward, can we get a little bit more sophisticated in the ways we look at data?
Thea, we do have a question.
Yeah, that's it.
The question is, just for clarification, when we say progress monitoring should be occurring every 1 to 2 weeks, do we mean it should be happening in the classroom as well?
So you mean in the general?
Yeah, in the general setting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so progress monitoring is done with any kiddo who you want to keep track of them, right? So the difficulty is for us is it should just be really with kiddos, like we do weekly progress monitoring for kids who are in tier 3. We do every 2 weeks for kiddos who are in tier 2. This is kind of how I think of it. And then, but we may have some students who look kind of like they need intervention. Maybe they didn't quite get it benchmark, but we didn't put them in an intervention. So they may be in tier 1. You can do progress monitoring with them. In fact, I have some teachers who really like to progress monitor, not every single kid, but just those kids they want to keep an eye on, right? Who maybe aren't super far behind, but they just want to make sure that they are making those fluency progress. And it gives you an opportunity to just sit and listen to a kiddo read, right? Which is just good practice. And so it's just a structured way of listening to them read. So yes, I would say that you can do this in the general ed classroom too with any kids who you're interested in. I just want to see if they're making the progress. And it might be helpful, especially in this remote learning environment where we're maybe feel more disconnected from students and we aren't able to see them all the time, right? Like we can see them in classroom, we're in person. We can't see them all the time right now. So it may be something that you decide to do, maybe not again with every single student, because you don't need to do it with all the students, but maybe with those students who you just want to keep an eye on, right? You can definitely do it, and it doesn't take a long time. So I think it would give me a little peace of mind if I was working remotely with students to do progress monitoring with more students.
Thanks.
Hopefully that answered your question. Feel free to put in the chat if you need a follow up there. So similar to screening, right? So progress monitoring and screening are very similar. We're using similar measures, this kind of thing. So scheduling that one-on-one time, maybe 30 minutes a week where you're conducting progress monitoring assessments with students at risk. So maybe 30 minutes, one day a week, maybe up to 45 minutes, just depends on how many students. Again, you don't have to do it all on one day. You could break it up and do a few kids a day. I encourage that even when we're doing this stuff in person. And then again, give the asynchronous activities to students. This link here, this questions to consider when planning for remote progress monitoring, this is the one that has the videos that I really like. It's actually on page 2 of your document under reading question on collecting progress monitoring data remotely. If you click on that, that's going to take you to I think it's the NCI website. And they have, if you go through those questions, they're going to give you information from the vendors, from the people who publish the screening and progress monitoring about how to do things remotely. And then they're also going to have some links to videos that are really good of teachers actually conducting progress monitoring and screening with kiddos remotely. So I recommend highlighting that or putting a star or whatever you can do, or go ahead and just click on that link and open that up so you can look at it later. Okay, so now we're going to get into these instructional practices. So of course we know what explicit instruction is. Hopefully many of us have heard this, and also lots of practice. Like I said, these kids need lots and lots of practice. So when we talk about explicit, we're talking about direct, specific, deep, good explanations, clear, concise explanations, modeling of whatever it is that we're wanting students to do, concrete, visible, clear language is really, really important in these demonstrations, connecting prior knowledge with current learning. And then of course, practice, frequent practice, guided, so with us, so that's going to be during these synchronous times, and then distributed, so across time, so both synchronously and asynchronously, and then cumulative. So what we mean by cumulative is that they're putting skills together to do more, to accomplish more complex kinds of things. Okay, so what it looks like remotely, synchronously. So synchronous is going to look similar to what we say in person, right? So teacher explanations, so explaining the objective, making tasks concrete and visible. So using the same materials that you're going to have the students use, so it's not confusing, modeling step by step how to do these things, connecting that prior knowledge with the new knowledge. So referring to previous skills and the content learned. So making those direct connections for kids, because sometimes they don't make those direct connections. So really showing them how to do that through thinking aloud and bringing up that prior knowledge. And then practice that's frequent and guided and distributed. So having the students do things with you, giving them opportunities every single session to practice these things while you're sitting there, so you can give them feedback, and then putting these things together for more complex skills. Now, asynchronously is going to also be important, because this is going to be that extra practice that they need. And I know it's tough because you can't be there asynchronously with them, right? You can't make sure, but we can do this as much as we possibly can, give them asynchronous activities to do. So this is going to be a lot of recording yourself, so that students can go back and watch those recordings and see the explanations and see the modeling. Having them record themselves or take pictures of their work and uploading those or sending those to you somehow, so that you can then review it and give them feedback. And giving them more practice in these asynchronous sessions so that they can, again, you're not gonna be able to do it all synchronously. You're gonna have to rely on giving them some asynchronous stuff and then having them send those into you somehow. Recording seems to work pretty well for my daughter. That's what she does. She records herself talking about things or showing things, and then we also take photos of her work. So let me, is everybody okay with that? Because that was a lot of information on that slide. Hopefully everybody's okay with that.
Yeah, I think we're okay. I didn't have any questions yet.
Okay. So now let's talk about systematic instruction with scaffolding. We know systematic, right? So this is clear communication of this expectations, one step to the next, guiding them, organized, sequential set of tasks and goals. Now you've got to do these things well in person too. And so it's even more important remotely that we're really clear and we're really step by step so kids really know what to do. Moving from what they already know to this new, so again, connecting that prior knowledge to the new knowledge, providing those prompts and support. So providing that scaffolding when students need and that assistance when they need it to become independent. Now it looks similar, systematic instruction looks similar to what we would do in person, and so does scaffolding. The difficulty with scaffolding is you may have to get kind of creative in the scaffolding you provide. And so let me just give you a few examples here on this slide. So if you're using, for example, if you're a first grade teacher, maybe you're doing Elkonin boxes with kiddos, that's what you would normally do. You would have tokens for them to push in. Maybe they go and they find some coins in their house to use, or maybe a little toy, like maybe it's a kiddo who really likes cars, right? And so he gets some of those little, my son had all those, Hot Wheels cars. So maybe they could use those to push instead of the tokens that you would normally use. Again, using a whiteboard or a PowerPoint slide to practice doing some of these blending of sounds, playing word games. Again, I'll show you, I have an example here on the next slide. And then, like I said, my daughter's teacher dropped off. I mean, he had us go pick up a whiteboard and an expo marker so he could use that during small group time. So maybe having some kind of bag of scaffolds for kiddos to either pick up or that you can drop off with things like a mirror, a handwriting desk plate, like for forming the letters correctly. It has those little pink arrows. We know from research actually that helps kiddos with their handwriting and forming the letters correctly. Whiteboard, like I said, maybe some tiles, some letter tiles or graphing tiles for kids to be able to use in different activities. Think about, could we create little bags with scaffolds for the kids to use when we're doing our interventions or when they're doing their asynchronous work? So here's an example of just to kind of show you blending syllables, using a slide to practice blending syllables, right? So we're going to work on the long A, right? And we're working on these different spellings of long A. So we would say, okay, main, how is A spelled in this syllable? A-I. Tain, how is A spelled in this syllable? A-I. And why? Because it's in the middle of the syllable. So we use A-I in the middle of the syllable. What's this word? Maintain. What's the word? Maintain. And we can do that with other words. Val, I, date. Validate. What's the word? Validate. Okay, and how do we spell long A here? Oh, we spell it A consonant E. Here it's also in the middle of the syllable, and this is our other way. And sometimes we just have to know AI and A consonant E. We have to know those are the middle of the syllables, and we just kind of have to remember them. Day, break. What's the word? Daybreak. Yeah, good. So the break of day, right? When the day is beginning, that's a compound word. And then neighbor. What's the word? Neighbor. Good. And here we have that more complex spelling, that E-I-G-H for the A. Now we could do that with as many words as we want, right? And I just created this as just a PowerPoint slide. Of course, with younger students, with first grade, second grade, you're going to start with one syllable words and do sound by sound. But I wanted for teachers of older kiddos to kind of see how this would work, maybe in the upper elementary or even into middle, or I've even seen this in kind of tier 3 in high school classrooms. So we can go through, and then we can kind of play a fluency game, right? Where we maybe we take it out of the slideshow and we just pull up the PowerPoints, because in slideshow you can't see the little arrow and you can't manipulate stuff in slideshow. Take it out of slideshow, and then we can use the arrow to point at different words and have the students play, right? So we can take it out of the slideshow and we can point at a word, say, okay, ready, 1, 2, 3, what's this word? Maintain. 1, 2, 3, what's this word? Insanely. 1, 2, 3, what's this word? Tailgate, right? So we can play a fluency game too. So it doesn't have to be in slideshow to do it. We can play games, and you're going to be able to play more games, honestly, in not slideshow. So now here's another example of a slide to practice building words. So this is a building words game. This is doing obviously morphology. So we've got prefixes, so a couple of prefixes, some base words and suffixes, and we can do what are called word sums, right? So we can say, okay, so let's see if we can create a word sum using a prefix, a base word, or a suffix, or some combination. So here's one I can do: un plus cover equals uncover, right? Let me see, and then we can do another one: rename. So we could do, I can model a few of these, and then I can let the students work, right, on their own and see if they can come up with some word sums. They can share those in small group. And if they get good at it and figure it out, this could be an asynchronous activity that I could give them to see how many words you can come up with, and tell them, you know, I came up with 20 words with these. See if you can come up with all 20 words. And then the next time you get back together, they can share their words, and you can go over, and they're going to come up with some words that aren't real words, and you can talk about whether those are real words or not, and why we don't have those words. So that's another example. That's a word building game we could do. All right, feedback. So feedback, we know, is highly, highly important, especially for struggling kids. Like I mentioned earlier, it's trickier in it's tricky in remote settings to provide the feedback, but we know it's important. So trying to figure out some different ways to provide this feedback: timely feedback, specific feedback, immediate for certain tasks like spelling. So we want to help kids correct those spellings pretty quickly. But we can, for more complex processes like writing a summary or maybe writing a text, we have a delay in the feedback we provide them. The idea here is to prevent inaccurate practice, increase the rate of student mastery, and ensure successful, efficient learning. So like I said, it's trickier providing this feedback, providing as much feedback as you can during the synchronous session. So making sure we're providing that. Having students hold up papers or whiteboards for you to comment on. Whiteboards are easier to see, obviously, than paper through the video. So whiteboards may be your optimum, especially like I've started bringing these classes, and helps me to see. When you're doing echo or time readings, providing feedback about what you heard. So providing that positive feedback to students, and then maybe one thing to work on, maybe attending to punctuation or making sure they're reading through the whole word when they're reading multisyllabic words. Again, if you can, setting up one-on-one synchronous sessions to give a little bit of feedback. You can give a lot of feedback in a few minutes, in 4 or 5 minutes. So having some of that one-on-one time, maybe each week, where you just get with these kids, especially the kiddos who are in intervention, who need more of that feedback, more of that immediate feedback, setting up those times to meet with them and go over their work and give them something, a goal to work on for the next day or the next couple of days before you're going to get to see them. Again, maybe synchronously one-on-one. And then also having students record themselves. Like I said, this is a good way, and discussing their work. So reading, if they wrote something, have them read it aloud and record themselves reading their writing aloud to you. And then you can kind of give them feedback that way. So let me just play this example. So this is going to be an example of this little girl. This is my daughter. Let's gotta use who you got at home, right? So this is my daughter. She's going to be reading, and so I want you to just pay attention as you listen to her read. What would be your feedback to her? What would be some of the positive feedback you could give her after she gets done reading?
The duck-billed platypus is an animal so strange that when it was first reported, people refused to believe the stories. It is a mammal. Like every other mammal, it nurses its young with milk. Like the others, its body is covered with hair. However, the mammals bear living babies. The platypus lays eggs. It also has a bill like a duck, and it has webs of skin. Between its toes, it has a poisonous spur on its back leg, like some.
Okay, so just put in the chat what would be some positive feedback you might be able to give her real quickly.
We have great expression, and she does an awesome job paying attention to punctuation, which I totally agree. That's from Vanessa. Me personally, that is just very fluent reading. And I like how in the initial part of the video, she was able to take a minute to look at what she was reading. She was reading mammal, if I remember correctly, and she needed to stop and look to think about what she was going to read next. And I really like that for context.
Yeah.
She has great eye tracking, Monica says. Haley says pauses at commas, very fluent. Lisa says pausing when she is unsure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Great fluency, expression, enunciation, great word recognition. So
Very
for
cool.
sure.
Yeah. So let's listen to the feedback that her teacher, me, is going to give her and see what you guys think. Hi, Alex. I wanted to give you some feedback on the reading that you submitted. I wanted to share a couple of things that I saw that you did in your reading that were effective. One was reading the longer words, those multisyllabic words like platypus and poisonous and reported and mammal. You did a good job reading those words fluently and automatically. The other thing that you did that I heard you do was you were reading and having your voice go up and down like you should. And I really noticed on the one sentence that said, the platypus lays eggs, you said that with a lot of feeling because it had an exclamation mark at the end. So I noticed that too. And I wanted to challenge you with a couple of harder, more difficult questions. One is, what is the suffix on the word poisonous, and what kind of word, what part of speech does it make the word poisonous? And then my other challenge to you is, why would the author put an exclamation mark at the end of this sentence that says, the platypus lays eggs? The sentence before says, however, other mammals bear living babies, the platypus lays eggs. Why did the author put an exclamation point at the end of that sentence? I'm curious. I want to hear your responses to those two questions when we meet next. Thanks again for the recording. All right. So I said some of the same things that you guys said, of course. And you can see also the thing I wanted to do was give her something to think about and to challenge her, because her reading, like you guys said, was pretty fluent, right? It was fluent. So so she's not struggling with fluency as much or reading those longer words. So I was trying to give her maybe some higher level things to think about doing and thinking about for the next time we meet, right, in a synchronous way. So and she did have a little bit of issue in one place with attending to punctuation. She didn't focus on the period on one sentence kind of toward the end, and it threw it off a little bit. It would have thrown off her comprehension. So I was going to wait and focus on that when we meet synchronously again, is to give her that feedback and talk about making sure that we were phrasing correctly and paying attention to those ending punctuation. So good. All right. So really quickly, the end of this is these last two policies and practices are about teacher knowledge and resources. So what I have here on these slides are just some ideas about things to think about, books to read, videos to watch, podcasts to listen to. And these are a lot of the things that are in the handout that you got. So if you go to especially the evidence-based materials and practices, but even on that first page too, online learning for teachers, that's going to give you some of these things I'm going to talk about. So these are some good books. Patrick, we have this booklet, the one for middle school teachers. That's actually based on interventions that we've done at the Meadows Center with reading interventions for middle school kiddos. You can download that at our Building RTI website. These are some online learning. So that obviously the teacher reading academies are going on right now. So I highly recommend those if your district's involved with those, or school for K-3 teachers. This using research series is actually a set of online modules I created for the Building RTI on the Building RTI website. So when I say Building RTI website, if you click on the links that are under using research to inform literacy instruction series on your handout, it will take you to the Building RTI website. And there's tons of materials there related to reading interventions, just so, I mean, almost too much. All for early elementary, upper elementary. We have some stuff specifically for upper elementary that can also actually be used in middle and high school. Middle school booklets, and then also some things that are more toward even high school, because we've done interventions in high school too. Of course, NCII has lots of great materials, and then the Center on Instruction too has some really good publications for research-based instruction. These are some videos. These are also in your handout. I don't have time to go through all of them, but these are just some really good ones, and some really good podcasts that have been done recently by this woman, Emily Hanford, for NPR and some other folks looking at why kids struggle with reading. Evidence-based materials. So looking at that this is that last policy practice from our brief. And my favorite tools are these IES practice guides. So again, if you click on that, there's going to be a whole bunch of them, and they're not just for reading. There's math, there's behavior, there's writing. The writing ones are really good. But these three that I have on the slide here are obviously focused on reading, both in elementary, early elementary, upper elementary, and then also the middle one here is for secondary, has ideas for interventions for secondary students. Two others that we've given you are the What Works Clearinghouse from IES. So this basically lists intervention programs, and go in and look at the research, what they found related to those. And then also, this is a newer website, this Evidence for ESSA, these evidence-based reading programs, similar to the WWC, the one we just looked at, the What Works Clearinghouse. Again, just a list of reading programs that you can pull from, not just reading, they also have math you can see across there, behavior, social, emotional, those things. All right, and then just a few additional resources really quickly. The NCI website is great. It has these tools charts that you can go into and look at the research on different screening tools, progress monitoring tools, and intervention tools. So those are going to be the programs. They have them for reading and they have them for math. And then these are some pretty cool websites. Some of these are newer because they've just created them to help with remote learning. The literacy strategies to support intensifying interventions. That's just going to give you ideas for intensifying interventions, whether in person or online. The National Center on Improving Literacy, these are going to be some remote literacy learning implementation toolkits. So those are really helpful, obviously, for remote learning. This University of Florida Literacy Institute, a principal just showed this to me for teaching reading online. They've got some really good videos that show teachers teaching reading online, specifically in small group and interventions. And then, of course, TEA has created this really awesome Texas Home Learning website that has free resources for supporting learning in a remote environment. Okay, that's a lot of resources, but they're all in your handout. So go and click on some of those and see what you think. And if you have time, try to watch some of those videos because they're really good. All right, I hit the end. I'm 3 minutes over. Sorry about that, you guys.
No, that's okay. We actually started 1 minute late. We started at 9:01. So it is perfectly fine. We are so appreciative, Thea. Thank you so much for all that you've shared with us. I wish you could have seen the comments that were just flooding in. They're still flooding in right now. Everyone is so appreciative. And as you guys exit, please be sure to attend to our survey that will pop up once you close your webinar screen, or once I exit out of the webinar session, so that you guys can give us feedback and just let us know anything that you need. Of course, here you can see our tier website, email address, where you guys can email any questions you may have about the resources that were provided, or any other questions you may have. Please know that our entire webinar session will be uploaded. The recording, the presentation itself, as well as the transcription will be provided on our website very soon. So thank you so much for being with us today. For those of you that have come back, thank you. For those of you that are new, welcome. We hope you come back next week. Next week, we will be shifting our focus to behavior intervention and within an MTSS model, so that we can see how that functions within remote learning environments as well. Dr. David Barrett will be with us next week. So anyhow, you guys have a great rest of your day. Again, Dr. Thea Woodruff, thank you so much. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.